Good morning and welcome to the I-29 Moo University Dairy Webinar Series. It's 12 noon. It's here in Northwest rainy Iowa. So we're getting some showers right now. Our topic today is, are robots right for you as you consider changes to the dairy system? And we're very pleased to have Jim Salfer from the University of Minnesota Extension with us here to present the topic. Folks are more than welcome to type any questions in the chat box there at the bottom of your page. At the end of Jim's presentation, we will open it up and you can unmute and go ahead and ask questions directly. At this point, Jim, thank you for being here. The podium is yours.
Well, thank you. And I really enjoy this. This is a topic I talk a lot on, and I don't have all the right answers, but I think I'll give everybody hopefully some points to ponder as they think about it and a decision they're trying to make. And of course, it's a big investment decision. So with that, we'll see if we can get everything working here. First of all, an outline's kind of be goals to determine if robots are a good fit for you. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about goals because I think that really ultimately is important. Maybe it might affect your expectations. And I do have a couple of slides on comparing the profitability of robotic systems to maybe potentially parlor systems. And then what are some of the keys to optimizing robot efficiency? Get those questions a lot. And then what are some of the challenges of robotic milking systems? I think if people move from a parlor system to a robotic milking system, there seems to be these challenges. Might not be quite the right term, but I think what are some things you kind of need to be aware of that maybe you haven't thought about before you move to these systems? So as I mentioned, what are some of the goals that you're looking for installing robotic milking systems? Is it really maximum productivity per cow or per robot? Or is it primarily to improve the efficiency and labor efficiency and improve productivity? Or is it to maximize lifestyle benefit? Now, originally, when robots were developed in Europe, one of the main reasons was really this whole lifestyle and improving the lifestyle of dairy farmers. Do you want to be able to expand your herd with minimal hired labor? So is this primarily a family labor or a family situation, or expand the potential labor pool? I think it's a different type of labor that you can hire to work in a robotic milking system than someone that may be interested in standing in a parlor pit and milking for several hours a day. And I think these goals will help you ultimately prioritize your investments, think a little bit about your labor structure now and in the future, and then think a little bit about expectations on your farm, because to maximize productivity per cow and per robot, that may not maximize your lifestyle benefit that you might have. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. We've got multiple robot systems we can look at. And so this is just mostly an opinion, but I think it's kind of close. Labor, for example, free flow are going to be a little bit higher labor than a guided flow system where you've got gates that can help you get cows through. The rotary system, part of that, I was thinking about the rotary robots here. Labor, you do need one person on site. So it kind of depends on how many cows you have, whether it's higher or lower in labor. Of course, initial investment, typically the lowest is likely to be maybe a freestall barn, maybe not on a per cow basis, depending on how many cows you put through your rotary robot. Management complexity, that's just kind of my term. I think it's a little bit higher in maybe a guided flow system, because you've got to think a little bit more about how you're going to manage cows as they get in the commitment pen. How do I get them through the robot? But I think feeding complexity is a little more of a challenge in these free flow systems, because you don't have the gates to help you. And of course, with the rotary system, management complexity and feeding complexity are exactly the same, because you're batch milking all of your cows. Nothing really changes because you're not expecting feed to attract them in. And then what about these semi-automated rotary parlors? I don't think we maybe talk a little bit about that, and that's not the topic of my conversation today. But I think we can also think about how do we automate a parlor system? And I guess that's really more and more capable in a rotary system. Or what about hybrid systems where we continue to milk in our parlor, an alternative system, but we build a robot barn? And for many of our small farms, that's not really their goal, is to maximize productivity of our robots. But for a larger dairy, I think we're seeing more of those, and I think it's a real option, because then you can really focus on putting your good robot cows and making that robot system really, really efficient. Let's look at some of the economics. And the way I look at this is data in our FinBin data system at the University of Minnesota. It's more than just Minnesota farms. I think there's a number of Ohio farms. I think there's a few from Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. I'm not sure there are any other ones. There might be a North Dakota farm or two in there. But what I do is slice this to look at farms about the same size. So these are 50 to 500 cow dairies in our conventional system, or a conventional sort. And so the majority of these will be milked 2 times a day. So as you can see, as you might expect, the robot farms on an average make more milk per cow, because they're probably, most of the conventional farms are going to be milking 2x to something above 2x. You can see the labor efficiency gain that we get from going to robot dairies. I hear a lot of comments about feed cost in these robotic milking systems, but us and even some data at Pennsylvania, it's hard to pick that up. I believe dairy farmers' information, and it might be the way the data is captured in some of these systems. You can see milk price here, and I see that once in a while. I think some of our robot dairies struggle a little bit more with components potentially than some of our conventional dairies. And I don't know if that's because they tend to be feeding a little bit more pellets. I can't ever pick up anything when you look through the literature on seeing any subclinical acidosis, but you do sometimes see this a little bit lower milk price with these robotic milking systems. Turnover rate, no difference. Estimated labor per cow, as you can see. Again, reduced labor with automatic milking systems. Return per cow tend to be a little bit lower in our robotic milking systems. I just don't have time today, but when you really dig into the information, it's a lot of this is depreciation and interest, because these are newer systems than some of our conventional systems. But you can see on the higher profit herds, this top 40% is sorted on net profit, so you'd expect it to be higher profit. But my point of this is there are some robotic dairies that are doing very, very, very well. And if you put in a robotic system, that's what your goal needs to be. When you look at it again, number of cows, this is the milk production. This is a little bit newer information, but you can see the labor per cow. Again, the net return per cow, looking at that. One thing I just like to show is this slide. And the numbers on top are the sorted profit cohorts. And so this is the bottom 20% profit, robot and conventional, the most profitable herds, robot and conventional. And what I'd like to point out is, if you're a bottom profit robot herd, you sink really fast. And part of that is because of the extra investment that you have in these systems. So if you're a conventional dairy, obviously, the conventional dairies are also losing money if you're in this bottom profit cohort, but you lose a lot more money with robots than you do in a conventional dairy. So I think it shows if you can't achieve good profit or good production out of this robot dairy, you can go backwards really fast. And so I think you really need to ponder that if you have the right management ability to really make a robot system work for you. So what are some of the factors that affect? I guess I've talked about this already. It's milk production change compared to alternative systems. And that's what I'll talk a little bit as I move ahead. Milk production per robot and per cow, labor saved with robots, and robot cost compared to an alternative milking system. So those are really the factors that affect how robots compare. And then I mentioned, what about these hybrid systems? More of the minor factors is repair costs. a robot useful life. How long are you going to keep this robot? You know, if you're 60 years old and you're going to put in robots and in 5 years you're going to be out of the dairy industry, I know there's a salvageable value to a robotic system, but maybe you're better off limping your old system along. The other thing that plays into there, and I don't have time to show it today, is really what is potential future wage inflation, primarily if you're hiring milkers and you're replacing some of that milker system or some of that milking labor with robots. The higher you think future wage inflation will be, the more profitable robots become. So one of the things as you're moving into these robotic systems is, can you reach the targets for efficiency? I think these are some of the targets, are maybe a little bit higher than that you saw 4 or 5 years ago. We need to get a lot of attaches per cow. You can see the milkings per cow. Ideally, you want to be down here in the goal in milk per cow. We used to say, and it still is, really above 6,000 pounds of milk per robot is a really good number. Think of this as maybe a 28, 29, 30,000 pound herd. You know, 10 years ago, our robots, you might get one robotic farm to reach this maybe on a monthly basis, but now we're seeing farms that consistently, year after year, meet this number. It's not a lot. Again, think about it like maybe like a 30,000 pound herd, something like that in a conventional dairy. But if you can get to these numbers, you're more likely to be, much more likely to be profitable. There doesn't seem to be a lot of connection between milk per cow and milk per worker. And so I think you've got to structure, and the point of this slide is you've got to really think about that labor structure and how are you going to structure and design your barn so you can cut back on labor and get a lot of milk per man hour. These are really the 3 factors that affect production when switching to robots. You've kind of got the robot and barn, the milking frequency, and the labor sparing effect. And so I see a lot of farms that'll say, well, I'm up 10 pounds in milk from a robot, and they're giving credit to the robot. I think a lot of times that's a barn effect. You know, we're sometimes going to maybe a tie stall barn with little rubber mattresses or an uncomfortable freestyle barn to a brand new barn that's better ventilated. You know, really the milking frequency clearly is a robot effect, right? If I'm going from 2x to 2 plus x, 2.7 or 2.6 or whatever it might be, that's clearly a robot effect. The other thing I didn't think about enough till I talked to a lot of farmers, but there's kind of this robot sparing effect, particularly our family farms where there's really minimal or maybe no hired labor. It's just hard to get everything done in a day. I mean, think of you're chopping hay and you need to stop to milk cows. Well, with robots, you're a little more flexible around that time, so you can get your hay put up on time. You maybe eat your cow's bread on time. You can do a better job of raising calves. And I think we maybe underestimate the value of that and how much of an effect on production that can have. So what are some of the keys? I think you need really good nutrition and feed management as you move forward. And this is kind of the cascade I go through. And I think feed management is more important in a robotic dairy than it is in a conventional dairy. You really, as I talk to these people, the robot dairies that get a lot of milk per cow, they'll say, I really, really have a good pre-calving management diet, because that really promotes high post-calving intake. That promotes healthy fresh cows. So we got cows that are healthy, they come in, they're feeling good. That promotes high early lactation visits because they're moving around, they're hungry, they want those pellets. That drives more milk production, which drives more feed intake, which drives more intake, which drives high production, which drives more intake. And you can see you kind of get this circle. Now that's a little bit different from a conventional dairy. In a conventional dairy, we chase our cows up, right? We are going to milk them 2 or 3 times a day. And so we don't have, not that we don't want healthy cows, but it's more important to have these healthy, aggressive, really good cows in a robot dairy, because that's what makes this whole circle work. Is that as they're healthy, they want to visit, they eat the PMR, And ultimately, this is what we want, right? We want high visits, we want low fetch cows, we want high production, and we want healthy cows. So what are some of the feeding management recommendations? And this is really going to focus mostly on feeding management. Again, this is really no different than we want in our conventional dairies. There's nothing new here, really. But just as a reminder, ideally, we don't want to overstock these free stalls. Ideally, we want lots of bunk space pre-calving. We want really good, high quality forage in the PMR. What that does is it allows us to feed higher energy without real high starch, and it really keeps our cows healthy. And we also need to really make sure we adjust for forage moisture. We make sure our particle size is all the same size. Because one thing that does change a lot in robotic dairies, if moisture changes, if particle sizes aren't consistent, you really start losing visits. And you also end up with a little bit more fetch cows because the cows aren't all eating the same diet. And so bunk management and feeding management, I would argue, is more important in a robotic dairy because we don't go out every day and get our cows and chase them to the parlor. If a cow's a little bit off, she's going to get milk twice a day. If she's a little bit off in a robot barn, she might end up as a fetch cow. And if you get very many of those, that causes a lot of frustration in our robot dairies. Some of the things that we've shown that have really associated with higher production is using more than one type of robot feed. I don't think a lot of people have looked at this, and you can see we had up to 3, but statistically we didn't pick it up, but you can even see feeding 2 different feeds. We ended up with maybe just a little bit higher milk production. But I think and you can see higher milk production per robot. And so I think it's really important to at least ponder, should I be feeding more than one feed through my robotic system? And I think if you talk to your nutritionists, I think they'll say, yeah, it's a little easier for me to balance a diet. I think you can feed some of those goodies. That's a real advantage, quite frankly, of a robotic milking system, is we can feed our fresh cows differently without necessarily having a fresh cow pen. So I think some of our better farms are doing that. Another thing, of course, is barn design. Again, I will argue it's probably more important in a robotic dairy than a non-robotic dairy. And what we want, I think actually this picture is from Kalmar at the Iowa State, but you can see there's not a lot of cows standing in the alleyway. There's a lot of discussion about robot barns. Do I need wider alleyways in order to get my cows to the robot so they can walk? I'll argue make a really, really comfortable bed so that cows lie down, and then you won't have a lot of cows standing in your alleyway. So you need good ventilation. Again, nothing different than we want in a conventional dairy. Soft beds, clean bedding, well-designed stalls. We need access to feed and water. We need crossovers. We need a good foot bath. Foot bath location is always, we can spend a lot of time in the questions and answers talking about pros and cons of different foot bath locations. I think we do need to think about our design barn for labor efficiency. And I think of a robot system, and if you're considering robots, think of it as a new system. You're not just plopping a robot in an existing facility. You can do that. I'm not against retrofit, but you need to change your mindset that this is an entire new system that you're installing. So think about fresh cow management, how and where you're going to do it, and what's the easiest way to get cows to that robot facility. Again, are you going to milk them in a different facility, that first milking? You're going to move them to the robot barn? Again, there's pros and cons of each of those, particularly from a robot efficiency standpoint. Are you going to have separation pens, or are you not going to have separation pens? I'm a fan of separation pens, quite frankly. And again, it's mostly a labor efficiency standpoint. It's a little bit easier to go out and get a sorted pen if she's only got a couple cows and you can get her back through the robot versus if you have to go in a pen of 120 cows. Headlocks, it just makes cow management a little bit easier. Drovers lanes, split entry to the robot. I don't hardly see any designs now in freestyle barns without that. Strategically placed gates. Gates are your friends. And then if you've got a If you got a guided flow system, really think about a well-designed commitment pen for those barns so they work well, get good cow flow. Herds with automatic feed push-up had more milk per robot. This has been repeated in Canada, picked this up. There's been some other places that picked it up. Ours, we ended up with quite a bit more milk. I'm not sure I would believe you're going to get 11 pounds on an average in dairies. That's what we picked up, but I think it's pretty common. I think maybe half of that number or something is worth it, what you might get. Automatic manure removal, we associated that with greater milk production. Again, it's whether it's milk production or not, I think it clearly affects labor efficiency in these systems. So we did pick up an advantage in milk per cow and also in milk per robot. So what are some of the factors affecting milk per robot that we picked up? Just milking visits per day. This is milk per robot. So milking visits per day. So how many just total visits end up through the robot? As you can imagine, milking speed, and of course, those two are kind of tied together, right? They're associated. The faster your cows milk, the more free time you have open in your robot. And so the more potential milking visits you can get. We picked up more cows per robot unit, and I'll show data a little bit later. There's actually some other research that was done that kind of picked that up too. So it's kind of a balance, and that's a big debate in the industry now. What is a right number of cows per milking unit? I'll maybe talk a little bit about that later. Automatic alley scraping, we picked that up in one of our studies. Robot feed per cow. Remember, these are associations, so it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. Do cows and farms that milk more, do they just feed more robot pellets, or does feed more robot pellets cause cows to make more milk? Multiple feeds, again, we picked that up. Residual feed, for people, the way we defined residual feed is feed that was offered to the cow, but she did not consume. You really can't get pellet intake necessarily. You just can get pellets offered in the robot. And so this would be, for an example, a cow is supposed to be fed 10 pounds and she only got offered 9 or 8 pounds. We picked up on an average, if cows ate less than that, we got less milk per cow and less milk per robot. More failed visits, again, not surprising. For people that might not be familiar with it, a failed visit is a cow that her milking permissions allowed her to be milked, but she did not complete that milking. So whatever reason, it couldn't attach, she kicked it off, whatever reason, she couldn't get milked. Refused visits, farms that had more refused visits, again, this is free flow facilities, more refused visits. So again, a refused visit is a cow that comes in and it's not time for her to milk and it boots her out. Well, of course, that takes some time. And so we picked up, and there's been a couple other studies that have picked the same thing up, and robots per pen we picked up in one study. This is a study I was talking about. I think this is an interesting study that was done. It was actually a summer intern that did this study for a feed company and related to income over feed costs. So they looked at feed cost, and these were farms. This is all herd information, but pounds of milk per visit. So this isn't pounds of milk per cow per day. It's just milking permission settings. Very strong correlation with pounds of milk per visit. Again, it makes sense to me because if a cow comes in and she got 10 pounds of milk in her udder, it takes the same amount of time to prep that cow as if she got 20 or 30 pounds of milk in her quarter when she comes in. That makes some sense. I think we can think more about what these milking permission settings are. PMR dry matter intake. Again, this is kind of whole herd. They didn't have individual cow intakes, but the more PMR dry matter intake, again, it kind of makes sense because high producing herds are going to eat more PMR. Total dry matter intake, starch in the PMR. So the higher starch, so a little higher energy, which would, it's a little bit counterintuitive because at least several years ago, one of the thought processes was if you got too many fetch cows, you just crank down the energy in that PMR. Well, here they got again, looking at income over feed cost, they had a little higher starch levels, actually more profit. Robot refusals, again, picking that up, and feed cost, pellet cost per ton. This is the same study looking at more factors related to production. PMR dry matter intake was related closely to production. PMR cost, so a higher cost per day was actually in the PMR was related to higher production. Total dry matter intake, not too surprising. Higher PMR crude protein, higher PMR starch was related to that. Again, see pellet cost per cow per day was less. Pellets offered was negative related to production. So the more pellets, these farms, 32 farms and Wisconsin farms, the more pellets offered, they actually had lower production. So if you look at the picture here, what it really says is these farms had a higher energy, higher starch, higher energy. They got more intake from their PMR, a little less pellets, and they actually ended up with a little higher production, which is maybe a little bit different, maybe than we heard a few years ago, where the emphasis was on let's feed more pellets and let's keep that energy in the PMR really low. And I think that's a trend that I'm seeing as I work with farms too. I think the average number of pellets fed to farms on cows is actually maybe a little bit lower than I would say it was 10 years ago. Now a little bit more in the PMR. And this is easier if you have high producing herd. This is really a challenge if your cows are averaging 60 or 70 pounds a day, because you've got to be feeding those high producing cows a lot. And you can't be feeding really high energy because those low producing cows won't visit the robot. So this is a lot easier if your average herd production is higher. But I think it's interesting research. Another key is high milk per cow and per robot. I'm going to talk a little bit here about visits. Early lactation visits promote high intake, high milk production. I talked about that earlier. And high milk per cow is correlated with high milk per robot. Not surprising, we picked that up in our studies. You get a lot of milk per cow, typically you're going to get a lot of milk per robot. This is just some data from one farm. It's from Mike Brook, and it's just kind of an example farm. But when you look at it, this is, and I showed first lactation cows only. I've got the data for second and third lactation cows. Data looks exactly the same, but you can see here days in milk, average visits. So cows that visited 1.9 times, so milked 1.9 times per day, they average 48 pounds. You can get these heifers to go 4 times, they averaged 95 pounds. Same thing with later lactation cows, no different. This is amazing. I mean, it is amazing when you can get these visits out of these cows. Here, 145 days in milk, 4.1 visits. So they're visiting well, 100 pounds. It's a lot of milk out of a heifer. And that really is one of the keys if you can. Now, not every cow reads a book and will do that, but the goal would be to get a lot of visits in early lactation. This is just some data from one of our farms that did a study, and we looked at, or this is all of our farms, I'm sorry. The number of farms are on the bottom, so each of these numbers is a specific farm. And you look at the yellow dots here. These are farms, primarily this is more of a challenge with first lactation animals. Older cows, boy, if you've talked to your robot farmers, they go in, they visit, that's not so much of an issue with them. But you can see here, a percentage of these farms, a pretty high percentage, even at the 4th week when we'd really expect they should be kind of adjusted, they've been milking a month, that's really when we want them visiting. A lot of them on an average, remember this is an average, so that means there's a percentage of these heifers that are not getting milk twice a day. And I think that's really a challenge. So it is kind of a challenge in some of our herds that we need to figure out. Pre-training heifers increases early lactation. This is a farm in Minnesota. I'll show you the data later, but they had expanded their barn. These are the close-up heifers, and you can see where they kept them here, and there's a robot sitting right here. And they thought, well, why don't we kind of walk those buggers through a couple of times a day and see whether they'll train, whether that'll improve visits or not. So this is kind of a before and after. This isn't a controlled trial. So we took information before they started pre-training heifers, after they started pre-training heifers. And you can see this is by days in milk on the bottom. So basically by weeks, 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 week, and on so on. And you can see that even by the second week, we not quite a visit, 0.8 of a visit more per cow per day. Out here, we were basically by 3 weeks in, they averaged 3 visits per cow per day. And this is what we want. I mean, here we're at 3.2, 3.4, you know, compared to pre-training, they were at, you know, 2, barely 2. And this isn't that uncommon to see even averages of less than 1, even when you're fetching these cows. So if you can, kind of think about how you might pre-train these heifers. And there's a lot of creative ways to do it. Some of these farms are installing these training stalls. These are just a couple of pictures in farms. This one wasn't done. These are in their close-up pens. So they kind of built a box, obviously no milking robot in here, but they kind of sort of look like a milking pen. So they chase the cows through here. There's another one where they kind of walk, they give them a little bit of pellets. They walk them through here. I think some farms are trying to do things like this to get these heifers kind of pre-trained. There aren't too many that are actually putting them in a barn and running them through a robot. Most of them are thinking about what can I potentially do to train these heifers so everything's not new. There's another farm that here in Minnesota that they actually have their pre-fresh heifers in. They don't do it for a couple of weeks. They do it for 2 or 3 days, and they really think just the noises and walking through that robot really can help them at least get a little bit acclimated to what the robot might be like. I think get fresh heifers off to a good start. One of the concerns about fetching too often or too much with these fresh cows is I'm going to train them that they have to be fetched. And I think that clearly can happen. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that we can kind of train our heifers. But I think we want, our goal really is to practice the behavior you want in early lactation. So we do want a lot of visits early, and that'll hopefully equate to higher visits late and higher milk production. So one of the things we need to think about is the first 2 or 3 days, kind of teach them about the entire pen. This takes some time, but I think where these animals become chronic fetchers is if we walk into the pen, we get that cow, we chase her to the robot. We go into the pen, we get that heifer, we chase her to the robot or cow. I mean, after a while, she goes, well, I guess they're going to come and get me when it's time for me to be milked. So I think you need to be a little bit stealthy about this and try to prevent them from knowing you're chasing them to the robot. I think if we can, especially for our smaller herds, if you've got a large herd with people, a lot of people in the barn, you're manning it 24 hours a day, it's pretty easy for you to go in at multiple times and fetch heifers or fetch cows. For most of our smaller herds, I think that's hard. But I think if you can do your routine morning and evening fetch, and if you can, a couple of times a day in between. So maybe you want to go out at noon and you might have a cow you're checking for calving. You know, go out. I don't think you have to fetch them all. I would focus on these fresh heifers to get them, and fresh cows if they're not going through. But if you can, go out and fetch them maybe at another time or two. I would mix up that time. Don't make it the same time of day. Try to move slow again. Guide them. Don't chase them to the robot. Again, I think chasing them can lead to this chronic fection. Guiding them, kind of, maybe you got a rake in there and you're raking out some stalls or something and kind of guide them. And, you know, I think they'll get close and go, huh, look, there's a robot open. I guess it's time for me to go in. So I think some of this is just thinking through and being a little more strategic. A couple of things we need to ponder. What's the right number of milkings per cow per day? What's the right number of cows per robot? I think I'll just make some comments. I don't have time for a lot of slides, but the right number of milkings per cow per day. One thing I don't hear quite as much about, but there used to always be this discussion where people bragged about, well, my cows are being milked an average of 3 times a day. Well, my cows are milking an average of 2.7 or 3.2. I think that averages, I think, are a little irrelevant. It's a little bit like calving interval or days to first breeding. The average means really very little. The question is, am I getting the right cows milked the right number of times per day? I mean, if you've got a cow that's, 290 days in milk or 300 days in milk and she's milking 50 pounds, you don't want her milk 3 times a day. She's wasting robot time, versus a fresh cow that's 40 to 50 days in milk, milking twice a day. Well, they're your average. If you've got a old lactation cow milking 4 and a fresh cow being milked 2, your average is 3. Well, if you switch those around, you get the right numbers milked. So I think it's irrelevant. There's farms I go to that the cows are average milking really, really, really well. And they're being milked an average of 2.5, 2.6, but they're getting the right cows milked at the right time. So I think that's the question we need to be asking ourselves. I think another question is, what's the right number of cows per robot? It's kind of all over the place. You'll read stuff in the literature that they really think, boy, we don't want more than 50. Our data I showed a little bit earlier is that our data, again, if you get the right cows milked at the right time, is probably more than that. I think this really depends upon, I'll do a lot of caveats here. Number one, you're not going to get this the first couple of years you're in a robot, because you're figuring out management, your cows are figuring it out, you're trying to get really good robot cows. The other thing I think is it really depends upon your robot model. The newer robots are much better at identifying teats and attaching. So if you're buying used robots, or if you're listening and you've got some older robot models, it's harder to push up this number. And I think it varies a lot from farm to farm. Again, what's your goal? If your goal is maximum productivity per robot, I think you want to push this number up. I mean, there's some farms, there was a farm we were doing a project and they had 20% free time on their robot, and they were big cash crop farmers. And they said, we've got to have 20% free time on our robot because we're busy in the field. And if a robot goes down or something, we can't get there right away to get it fixed, and we get behind and we just can't get caught up. So part of this is really your goal, but this is some research we did. It's at Minnesota here, and you can see for each additional cow per robot, milk increased about 30 kilos. You can double this for pounds. So about 60 pounds per barn per day. And you can kind of see the trend here, and it's not over, but this is the kind of the magic 60 number. But there's a lot of farms over 60 and they get a lot of milk per robot. You can see here, we didn't have any farms that averaged over 5,500 pounds per robot that didn't have more than 60. And we had some farms out here, they were really pushing cows per robot, but you can see they're getting a lot of milk. And this isn't a daily average, this is a yearly average. So I think it pays to ponder this number, and do you want to manage to get that? Because it takes special management. I think we've got to deal a little bit. What are they dealing with the imperfections of robots? Because there's some things they aren't perfect at. Marginal cow prep and dipping. They're getting better, but if you look through the literature, they miss some teats. I try to get some video sometimes, but I don't always get them. But chapped teats in winter, you need to be a little concerned about that. Dealing with milk quality and mastitis. ID mastitis is trickier. You look at conductivity, it's okay. Some of the milk quality now, they have some, they try to give you some estimates of somatic cell count. I think on an average, it's probably not too bad, but I'm not sure individual cows are that good. Dealing with contagious organisms, that can be a challenge because of course you can't run separate groups. Some cows don't read the book and behave like you hope. You have some high producing cows that just will not go through very often. That's just life, right? Training heifers can be a pain, quite frankly. I talked a little bit about that earlier. It can be more of a challenge in some farms than others. Whoops. Alarms are a pain. Maintenance is expensive, but you have to do it. If I'm milking in a parlor and I have an automatic takeoff that doesn't work, guess what? I can manually take that unit off. You have to maintain these robots. It's very, very important if you want good performance. Light quarters can be a little bit of a challenge. I think I might have time to show a video. And I think it's a very different manager and employee skill set. So if you're a larger dairy and putting them in, your employees need a different skill set to manage robot. They've got to really think about which is the right ones to go out and get fetched when I'm there. They need to have some computer skills. They make them pretty foolproof, but you need a little bit of that. Here's just some pictures. You know, if you look at the picture in the bottom left-hand quarter here, this is a cow leaving, and of course she was post-dipped. You know, she won't have much bacteria growing in her udder, but I think the teats there might be some bacteria be able to get in the end of those teats. This is a prepping issue where it actually didn't prep the teat. It just kind of missed it and prepped the side of the udder. This is something I get some calls from people that say, I don't know if my robots are working. I'm just getting a lot of failed cows. And I said, send me some videos of what, and this was actually not a video that was sent to me. It was a video that was actually, I was on the farm and this cow failed and they said she always failed. So I just want you to watch this video. I think I have time to show it if I can get it to work here. Maybe I can't. Here we go. Nope, I don't think it's going to work on that screen. But basically what happens is it missed this black teat. It attached, and the farmer said that, yeah, that happens real common. And you can see this is really what you would think would be about an ideal robot udder, right? Back teats are not close together at all. Shouldn't have any problem finding them. But you can see that this quarter is a little bit light. Well, sometimes that laser has a tough time finding exactly where that teat is. And so this isn't a criticism of robots or anything, but just don't be surprised if you've got some lopsided quarters or udders on cows that you have a little bit of problem, some of those attaching. And, you know, you've kind of got to make a decision then. Are you just going to deal with those as failed because they'll fail a little bit oftener? Or are you going to prep with them, or are you going to call them? But those are some of the challenges. And it's not always just cross teats is my whole point of this discussion. Sometimes you can have these udders that look pretty darn good, and the robot can miss them. Let's see if I can get there we go. Keys to success, I'm kind of finishing up here, is high visits and early lactation, well-balanced diets, really excellent transition cow programs. Again, nothing different than a conventional dairy. We want to really get our cows bred. We need really good cow comfort, and we want a low somatic cell count. So with that, labor costs and availability is going to continue to be the challenge. I'm not telling anybody anything new that they don't know. I mean, drive up and down the street, everybody's looking to hire somebody. It does require really good management to be successful, like any dairy system. Excellent transition cow program. I talked about that already. Really good quality forages. I think it's important to help the robots succeed. Really think about your feed and milking access table. Work with the robot company reps. Work with your nutritionists. You need the correct employees. If you're the employee, you need to think about your mindset. You need the right mindset and management. You really need a best barn design if possible. If it's a retrofit, you can't always do that, but I think there's some designs that are better. Maintain your robot and keep everything clean. They work much better if everything's clean, lasers are clean, the area around the robot's clean. You know, a dirty laser or camera has a much more challenging time. Along with that, I don't think I have it on here. Keep those udders clipped or singed. Just do everything you can to help that robot succeed, and then make sure you select the right kind of cows. And the best is to think about it as a whole system. Again, I mentioned it earlier. It's not just plopping a robot down in a barn and hoping it works. It's kind of an entire system you've got to work with. And then, of course, you've got to make the cash flow work. I mean, robots are expensive. Do they work? Yeah, we all know farms that work really, really well on. But really think carefully as you move into the system, because it's an entirely new system. And if you get it figured out, it works really well. If you don't, the cash flows don't work very well. So with that, I'm finishing up here, and we got plenty of time for questions, and or discussion or a rebuttal is perfectly fine too. I'm open to being criticized. So with that, Fred.
Thank you very much, Jim. We appreciate it. We're kind of a small group here. If you have a question you'd like to ask directly, go ahead and unmute and ask Jim the question. Otherwise, we've got several questions in the queue here. I'm not seeing anybody unmute, so I'll go ahead and start. We've had a couple of questions. Does Breeda cow affect how many cows you can have per robot, especially the difference between Jersey and Holsteins?
That is a really good question. And I see there's also a question on looking, it was a FinBin data, mostly Holsteins. They don't really keep track of breed, but I would suspect, I wouldn't say 100%, but most of them probably are. That's a good question. I ask that question a lot, and I get that question a lot. We have had a couple of Jersey herds that have been a part of our studies. We didn't pick up that they were different. We didn't even pick up they were different in milk production than the Holsteins, because we put breed in there. But just visiting with Jersey dairymen, and there's a few dairymen that have both and have them separated on sides of the barn, they will say Jerseys are much more active. And so I don't know if that's again, the number is so small, but they'll say that, yeah, my Jerseys, they'll visit more often. They're just, they're a little different breed of cat. So I can't find any specific research that will pick that up, but just anecdotally from talking to farmers, they will say that Jerseys are more curious, they visit better, they go through more. There's probably a few less fetch cows with Jerseys. I don't know if that answers the question, but anecdotally, I think we hear that there probably is something to that.
Have we got any of the herds that are crossbreds, predominantly crossbreds, that you've looked at?
Yeah, not a high percentage of them, but we did have crossbreds in our study. There were, when we go to barns, a lot of those, we did have a percentage that were grazers, even some that were organic, and a lot of those had crossbreds. But we did, originally we heard that black teats were a problem. We would hear that pretty consistently. I think these dark teated cows, I haven't heard that now for several years. So it might be that the lasers and cameras are a lot better. So I would say, yeah, I think crossbreds probably work fine.
Okay, I've got a question here about feedback, about tilt and reverse tilt to the udders. It's a genetic component, obviously. Do they have special needs in a robot parlor?
Well, yeah, it'd be nice if you could, but those are the two issues, right? Close rear teats and reverse tilt. I almost think reverse tilt might be worse. A couple of things farmers do is if they have real close rear teats, they'll just set the milking pernitions worse. So those udders are longer, so those udders get fuller before they milk them. So it pulls the rear teats apart. The other comment is the newer robots are much, much better. It's unbelievable. They'll even attach the wrong, I think this might be on purpose, the wrong teat cup to this wrong cloth teat. So they're milking the teat on the other side. So it's really amazing. If you aren't familiar with robots and talk to robot farmers, they will attach a lot of unusual udder conformation. And so I don't know if there's any special settings you need to do. That's one, let the udder get a little bit fuller for these late lactation cows. And I think sometimes these real small teats are almost more as big of an issue as some of the cross teats. I'm not sure that answers the question, but they're the two problems: reverse tilt and cross root teats.
I have another question, kind of back to the labor conversation. What's a manageable size herd with one full-time person using the robots?
I think a lot about that. We're actually really trying to get a feel, because if you look at labor in robots, I just read an article this morning that was from Russia, actually, and they were speculating that robots saved about 30% on labor. I can find research studies that will say no savings in labor, and one's up to 30 and 40%. And one of the hard things, even in our, look at the FinBin database that I showed, if you talk to the people that get that data, it's really hard in a dairy to sort out by enterprise, especially if you're sorting out heifers, exactly how much labor is allocated to cows. So I think we've got that's something we're trying to capture. We're actually kind of trying to do a survey right now and get those numbers. We're not done with it yet. But I tend to use about an hour of, I'll call it milking like labor. So, and this was just from survey work I did a few years ago, called some farms I knew really well and asked them the question, not in the worst day, not in the best day, how much time are you spending kind of milking like labor? And, that was 45 minutes was a real kind of common number. So I tend to use an hour. So that's around milking time. So you've got all your feeding and your breeding and other things. But I think, if you've got a kind of a multi-family father and son, or two kids, or two brothers farming together, I think you're going to see a lot of those, maybe 4 robot dairies managing those. And I think they could probably do that with pretty minimal hired labor. I think a single family can really pretty easily manage a 2 robot system for sure. So, it depends on how many, whether you're raising heifers on site, etc. But I think just managing the barn, I think easily 2 robots.
If we have anybody who wants to ask a question direct, just go ahead and unmute. Go do that. Otherwise, Jim, you've worked with some of these herds a long time. After 3 or 4 years, is there a common change that a producer would like to have done from the way his barn was designed? Is there something that you see fairly regularly commented on?
Well, I think they're kind of getting it figured out. I think, most of them like just general barn designs. Most of them like, and they're probably my favorite, is perimeter feeding. So ideally feed lanes, and these are a little bigger dairies, feed lanes on the outsides of the barn, and then the robot boxes in the middle, because then as you're moving cows, it's just a labor efficiency standpoint. You don't have to move them. If you're moving any cows, and then maybe you'll have a freshening pen on one end, it's a little easier. The disadvantage of that, of course, is with robot boxes in the middle of the pens, you've got to walk through the alley, so your robots get dirtier, or your robot rooms get a little bit dirtier. But I think that's almost the barn design we've kind of set up. So we got pens. If you're going to have a separation area, they're going to be kind of behind the robot. Those are really, really nice designed. I also like kind of the walk-through robots, or kind of the tandem design where they walk through, L-shaped design. I mean, I think there's a lot of good barn designs out there. It's kind of around, if you want a separation area, where you put that, and then design you almost have to kind of design a little bit about that. I think a lot of the retrofits are on the sides of the barn, the outside walls of the barn versus in the middle. I don't see those performing quite as well. And of course, these are all generalizations. But it seems like for whatever reason, they just don't seem to perform maybe quite as well as when the robot rooms are kind of in that pen. But there are some good attributes I think you want from a design standpoint. There's some, whether it's a guided flow system or a free flow system. Again, split entries, to me, you got to do that. I would protect. The other thing I really like is with the split entry is if that second entry from the fetch pen, you have that about a cow lengths long. And I didn't have time to show. I actually have a video where there's a cow kind of in a queue there, for lack of a better term. And I don't know if I'm explaining this well. So cows from the main pen can continue to go into the robot, but there's kind of this split entry where kind of one cow, and this cow clearly is a submissive cow, and this cow coming up behind her trying to get her out of there, and she feels really protected because she's got the robot room on one side, a gate on the other side, so she can kind of get cued in there. And I think in this barn has unbelievable performance. It's always one of our best performing barns. So I think there's some things around that robot design area, around the robot, that we can do to maybe help these submissive cows a little bit, because it's no different than a parlor, right? A boss cow gets every amenity in that pen anytime she wants it. We've got to think both about barn design and feed design to kind of protect those 2-year-olds and a little more submissive cows. Does Larry or Fred or you or Jen, I mean, you guys all have been on robot farms. Do they have any comments on any of these questions? I mean, I'd sure, if they've got some comments, I don't sure have all the answers.
Larry, any comments?
I would just have a comment. Maybe if Dana asked the question here about, like, for smaller herds of 200 head, how many years would you need to continue milking to really make it worth putting in the robots? And I would tend to say that from what the data that we've been seeing is, you know, you might have 5 to 7 year paybacks on these robots. But again, it kind of really depends on what you're trying to compare this to. So you're probably gonna have a quicker payback and possibly a different type of a milking system. And I like your comment about, you know, the year's useful life is actually more of a minor thing, but that depreciation and interest is actually quite real. So that's kind of the big thing, is just, you know, compared to some of these lower cost type systems versus a robot, you know, what's it going to be worth? I guess it really depends on, you know, what are the other maybe some non-financial factors that go into it, the quality of life, especially how much that's worth it to you. But I think, you know, payback wise, you know, we've been seeing some pretty good paybacks in that, you know, 5 to 7 year time frame.
Yeah, good comments.
Very good.
Janet, do you have any? Or Fred, do you have any?
Well, I think one of the things that we found was, and you alluded to it, was the first generation of robots are completely different cat from what we're seeing now. So as we see these being replaced and upgraded, it's, you almost have to get out and see what the new ones do if you're basing your estimate on what those original ones did.
Yeah, and I think that's a tough call, and I'd like to hear any of you guys' comments. You know, I've got to do a presentation for Dairy Science, and one of the discussions we have, we got an economist and said, you know, some companies, they'll do a, for lack of a better term, kind of a pilot. So they'll put in a whatever it is, kind of a pilot. And I wonder if some of our farms would kind of be a step into robots, because we did a survey a few years ago with some people out of Wisconsin. And one thing is, when you move to robots, there's more variation in milk production. So a farm goes from a, not surprising, a tie stall barn to a parlor, or a parlor to a new parlor. Their milk production was much more predictable, the change, than if they went to robots, which makes sense, right? I mean, it's an entire new management system that you're voluntarily looking at. So I think these hybrid systems, even as people are maybe shifting, and maybe you want to get there if you're a small dairy, but I think there are some advantages of continuing to milk in your old system, partly from a financial standpoint. You know, you can just milk more cows. So it's not really a pilot, but I think kind of stepping into these systems sometimes from a purely economic standpoint, not maybe a lifestyle standpoint. And we've got a smaller dairy here. What they did is they put in, they've got 4 robots. They had a parlor. They milk all of their fresh cows in their parlor, and then cows with wonky udders that they want to keep. But so it's not a lot, but they milk those twice a day. And they will argue that makes our robot, and they get unbelievable production in their robot, per robot and per cow. They said, we don't want to waste robot time. So if people are not familiar with robots, if a treated cow or a fresh cow, that has to do a mini wash. That takes time. So again, part of this is a mindset. They have this trade-off. I'm going to sacrifice a little bit of lifestyle because they still have to be there twice a day to milk, but it's not many cows, so we can milk really fast, versus maximum robot efficiency. And earlier I said part of this is kind of in your mind. There's some of these that are just trade-offs. So I think just make sure you get those cash flows to work and think these things through. There's not right or wrong answer. I can take you to successful farms that are doing lots of different things.
Okay, we've got one more question in the queue here regarding transitioning a herd to robots. They ask what percentage of the cows or heifers will you normally see transition without issue? And then I will add to that, what percent of especially older cows, they just never get the hang of it and wind up leaving the herd?
Well, that's a good question. Transition, I don't know quite what the question is. Transition successfully, was that the question, Fred? I could maybe.
Yeah, in transitioning a herd to robots, what percent of cows or heifers do you normally see transition without issue?
Well, the simple answer is probably, I don't know what issues means. If that means they're going to learn in the first week, probably a pretty small percentage of them. I would kind of a general rule. There's going to be that percentage that learn, within the first month or so, or first 2 weeks. And you're going to have cows like me that are going to probably never learn, or going to take a whole lactation. But I think it almost takes a cow to dry up and come back in before you really feel like, boy, this sucker's going to work. I mean, just from a mindset standpoint, I'll tell you, you'll be in there a month or two, or maybe a month, and you go, I got stupid cows. They're never going to learn. This is the worst decision I ever made. My cows are different. No, your cows aren't different. It's just that they're taking a while. So I'm not quite sure, but it really almost takes till all those cows are kind of refreshing that you feel like you can take a breath and go, boy, this is really working well for me. So just expect some of those moments where you're going to bang your head against the wall and go, why did I do this? But they'll learn. I mean, they always do. As far as culling, it's a lot less than it used to be. And it varies some from herd to herd, and how many heifers you have coming in and how patient you are. If you've got a lot of space, say you got a 2 robot system or a 4 robot system, and you're milking 40 or 50 cows per robot, you can be a lot more patient and monkey around and give them time to do that. But if you're really pushing that facility, those cows go through pretty fast. One thing I'll say on a culling standpoint, as these people get in 5, 6, 7 years and they've got heifers available, they get pretty impatient with a cow that either is a fetch cow or has a poorly shaped udder or milk slow. They don't always get culled. A lot of times they might go to a neighbor's place, but part of it is how patient you want to be and how aggressive you want to be on how heavy you have to cull. But the robot themselves, they'll attach to a lot of unusual udder shapes. It's a little bit more your patience versus the robot's ability to attach.
Very good. Any questions for Jim that you want to ask? Just go ahead and unmute.
Jim, I think you had on the one slide where you had the milk production differences, robotic versus the average non-robotic herd, and there's about a 94%, so about 6% increase in milk production. Then with the feed cost of $8 versus that $8.51, I mean, it's kind of like in that 6% as well difference. And I think early on we had a farm where we just asked the nutritionists. They were doing both robots and a conventional system, so we just asked them the difference in the cost of that ration. There was about 1/2 cent per pound. But as we take a look at just over the years, I mean, early on it seemed like they were spending more money in feeding a cow on a per day basis. But as we look at the increased milk production per hundredweight, it seems like it's pretty much a wash, where the robots now might actually be getting an advantage in feed cost. What's your take on it?
Yeah, Fred, I mean, Larry, when I talk to farmers about it, and I said the nutrient requirements are exactly the same. If you have a cow milking 100 pounds a day in a robot dairy or convention dairy, the feed cost is exactly the same. The only difference in cost you really should have is the cost of that pellet. or pelleting that pellet or getting the pellet. So and as you mentioned, Larry, if you can target the right cows with the right amount of feed, in theory, feed costs shouldn't be any higher. And Pennsylvania did a study a few years ago, and they had, and there wasn't a lot of herds. Again, I think it was a half a dozen herds, good producing herds in both conventional. I think it was interesting that there was really not much difference in feed cost. The feed cost per hundredweight was more consistent. And I think this is kind of what you're saying, Larry. The feed cost per hundredweight was much more consistent in the robot dairies than they were in the conventional fed dairies. They were a lot more variation. On an average, they were the same, but the variation was more. And I think that maybe goes to what you're commenting. We can maybe target those robot dairies a little bit more. But you do hear that a lot. Part of it is a check you're writing to the elevator, wherever you're getting your feed from.
Yeah, I think part of the confusion is as you take a look at feed cost per cow, yeah, it might be more in the robot because of the pellet, this, that, and the other thing. But because of the increased production, the feed hundredweight could actually be the same or even lower.
Correct.
So I'm kind of thinking that's the bottom line.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Well, I'd like to remind the audience if they would go to the chat box and click on the survey. By answering those questions and helping us out, we'll continue to have high quality webinars for our industry. Again, Jim, thank you very much for putting together a program that has a lot of information to, and we invite the audience to come back next month, July 14th. We will be sharing from Dr. Koninoff on feed additives and especially DDGs. So thank you very much for attending. I'll be signing off right now.